He fired her because of her tone. He did it where everyone could see. Midday light slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Cobalt Oak's open-plan floor, cutting the cubicles into bright bars. The elevator doors had just released a stream of clients and interns. A barista cup steamed on the reception counter. At the heart of the floor, where the marketing team kept its tanks of ficus and its cluster of awards behind glass, Jonathan Hale stood with his chest forward and his voice measured into the silence he had engineered. Jonathan spoke like a king in a small court, polished, practiced, and aware of every head that turned. His suit was the kind that suggested he could buy a ledger and not notice the subtotal. He liked to work in frames, the right frame for a photo, the right frame for a story. And today his frame was control. Across from him, Maya Bennett folded and unfolded her hands with a deliberate calm. She wore the company badge on a lanyard, the cheap plastic card that let her in and out like anyone else. Her intern ID said, Marketing, Intern. It was the smallest rectangle that had ever contained so much. The client feedback, Jonathan said as if reciting a catechism, has been clear. We can't project uncertainty. We can't have optics that suggest friction. I heard it in your tone in the meeting with Weston this morning. It doesn't fit what we sell. Maya's face did not flinch. She tilted her head almost imperceptibly, the motion of someone who measured syllables before permitting them to be heard. I asked a clarifying question about the brief, she said. I gave a suggestion that... You gave a suggestion, he cut in. That came across as undermining. You questioned a senior director in front of a client. That's not how we operate. He looked at the cluster of people around them and let his eyes rest long enough for consequence to settle. I'm letting you go, effective immediately, Div. There it was, a word with the weight of authority, placed in the bright air like a stone dropped into a glass bowl. Conversation stilled. Someone's phone discovered the moment, the lens tilting on the scene. 100 little conversations froze in place to watch what would happen next. Maya did not plead. She did not beg. She pushed out one question with the quiet force of someone accustomed to procedures. On what grounds, Mr. Hale? I need the written reason. Jonathan smiled in a way that was practiced to soothe dissent. We don't need to fill out forms for dismissal, he said. This is performance. It's also cultural fit. We're making decisions based on what's best for the company. A ripple moved through the bystanders. Some noses wrinkled. Someone shifted weight from foot to foot. A colleague, Anna in analytics, had her thumb already to her screen. Her hand was the first recorded witness. She kept it there, the red dot, a quiet punctuation mark on what was unfolding. Human resources materialized as protocol does. Seated, steady, the personification of a company's attempt at reason. Ethan from HR stepped forward with the neutral smile of someone who carries forms like armor. His voice was professional even. Jonathan, perhaps we should handle this through HR. Termination requires documentation. A witness to the conversation. Jonathan waved him off. We don't need HR to babysit. She failed the client. End of story. He spoke with a cadence that suggested this was easy, that he could perform consequences the way others performed small kindnesses. It was his favorite posture, decisive, immovable. The phrase cultural fit did the work of 100 small slights. It signaled more than competence. It invoked an idea of who belonged in the frame Jonathan curated. For the people standing there, it tasted like something they had heard before and inwardly catalogued. Complaints about accents, jokes over lunch about hair, offhand references to how we present ourselves. None of it violent, all of it additive until a person's boundaries were worn thin. Maya kept her voice low. I'd like that in writing, a formal explanation, and I'd like a copy of any documentation about the meeting. A murmur. The red dot on Anna's phone continued its slow burn. Jonathan's eyes narrowed, the only real sign of anger. He reached for a termination letter from a sheaf in his briefcase, a crisp page, embossed with the company letterhead. He pushed it across the glossy conference table like a judge passing sentence. Here, he said, sign here. We'll have security escort you out. There it was again. The small ritual meant to humiliate. Security, 2 men in bland lambent jackets, had been standing by near the elevator shaft, the company's body language for enforcement. One of them stepped forward, his badge catching the light like a milder echo of the plastic Maya wore. He cleared his throat and moved as if he had practiced this choreography. Maya's hand moved slowly. She did not snatch the paper. She took the sheet, read the neat paragraphs. The words read like a faculty memo. Performance issues, immediate termination, access revoked. Her fingers closed on the pen. Then she set both down. "Before I sign anything," she said, "I need the stated grounds for termination on formal letterhead, and I would like to file a request for a company hearing. I want to submit a formal complaint about the way this was handled, and I will be documenting everything." Her grammar was precise. The weight of it was legal more than emotional. She said documenting, a small word that was, in the room, a detonator. A younger account executive cleared his throat, eyes wide as he watched the scene. "You can't just—" he began. "You can," Jonathan replied, with the condescension of someone speaking to a child who had discovered a rule. "If you have complaints, HR can handle them. But for now, this is my call." From the corner of the open floor, a phone screen tilted. Anna's hand shook slightly. The onlookers' faces were a collage of sympathy and caution. Many had seen Jonathan's temper before, and had chosen the side that kept them safe. Ethan from HR looked at Maya, and then at Jonathan, and then back at her. "We really should do this formally," he said. "There are protocols." Jonathan's laughter in reply was more like a dismissive exhale. "Protocols are paperwork. I run the company. If there's any problem, I decide." What he named himself as, very quietly, was indispensable. The security guard, uncomfortable, apologetic, the public face of enforcement, moved to put a hand lightly on Maya's elbow. He meant to guide, not to push. Maya stepped back. Her elbow was steady. She kept a distance, the polite distance of someone who accepted the gesture but refused to yield to force. "Do not touch me," she said without heat. The simple phrase did more than dissuade the guard. It reframed the power exchange. He recoiled, embarrassed for a split second, like a minor actor whose cue had been misread. Jonathan's voice hardened. "You'll sign the letter or you'll have to collect your things. I'll have security remove you if necessary." Maya's gaze softened. "If you remove me, I will make sure the board receives a full report. I will be filing this with counsel as well." The name board landed there like a bell. The people around them had a sense of how corporate days worked. Some lines began at the office, but others were escalated. Memos, counsel, formal minutes. The board was the room where the company was larger than any man. Jonathan bristled, the way a man does when someone suggests there are constraints he has not accounted for. "You who? You think—" The thread of his sentence cut off when Anna's red dot on her phone registered a long voice note. She had started recording at the first admonishment, and now the room leaned toward the small device, an unblinking witness to the choreography of power. It was a small private rebellion in the era of phones. Everyone could be a recorder. The recorded word, flat, factual, had a way of undoing the gloss of performance. Jonathan knew it. He hated it. Ethan from HR stepped again into the space between them, professional and weary. "Jonathan, if there was a complaint about conduct, we need an investigation. If we proceed with termination, we have to document the grounds. Otherwise, there's risk, legal risk, reputational risk." Jonathan's jaw worked. "This is internal management. Nobody's reputation will be harmed. This is about preserving standards. Standards that seem to exclude certain people," Anna said softly, and the room shifted. Her phrase wasn't an accusation so much as an observation. She named a pattern, one that had been talked about in whispers, an insistence that the company had an aesthetic, a voice, a type. Naming that pattern made it visible. Maya stepped back into the day. She did not argue. She accepted the guard's passively offered arm when necessary, but she did not yield on her terms. She spoke to Ethan. "I will submit a formal complaint within 24 hours. I will include the recording. I request this be added to the record." Ethan nodded, already thinking in checkboxes. "We'll log it. We'll need a written statement, witness names, times." She gave them the time, the names. Anna's phone had already saved the recording. Another colleague, Jonah, had a shaky video from the other side of the room. These were the little modern instruments of accountability, small, personal, easy to replicate. When Maya left the floor, she walked with a slow dignity. She moved through the swing of people and ficus and bright award plaques. She kept her badge clipped to the lanyard, but out of habit swiped it as she went through the turnstile. The swipe was ritual. Access granted, then revoked. It had the texture of irony. Outside, clouds had been gathering. Rain began soft, a whisper at first, blurring the glass in the lobby into a watercolor. Maya's umbrella was folded in her bag. She did not pull it. She walked into the gray, as if the elements were a small truth she had always expected. You could be soaked and still keep your posture. In the executive office, Jonathan closed the door behind him and let his mask slip. His face hardened into the anger of a man who believed he had acted rightly and been questioned. He dialed PR, then legal, then a friend on the board. He paced the corner of the window and watched the elevator ascend like a column of glass swallowing light. He had a floor, a title, an entire curated history of making swift decisions. He had cameras in conference rooms and a private security team and a voicemail that never stopped. He could not stomach the idea of being second-guessed. His life was a collection of unchallenged decisions, and the idea that someone in a cheap badge could threaten that collection was intolerable. On his desk lay the glossy photos from the last gala. Him on stage receiving an award, him laughing with donors. He smoothed a hair off the desk like a man trying to iron out a wrinkle. "We'll handle it," he told himself. "This is small. We'll manage the optics. If she tries to make this a thing, we'll respond." What he could not know, what he refused to comprehend, was that the room he had closed himself in was not the room where all truth lived. The company existed in spreadsheets and memos, and the thin public lines that bound it to reputation. It also existed in files and registries and shareholder lists. It had a history that predated his tenure, and in that history were seeds of leverage he had never bothered to examine. Maya did not go straight home. She went to the small cafe 2 blocks from the office where the barista knew her order. She sat at the communal table beneath framed prints of mountains. She took out her phone and listened first to Anna's recording. Flat, factual, the edges of Jonathan's voice recorded into digital permanence. Then she opened an email and typed with a deliberate hand, to HR, to legal counsel, to a private attorney she had once worked with quietly while at university. She attached names, times, witnesses, and the file Anna had taken. The scene that unfolded in emails and digital pockets was quiet but relentless. She copied the recording to a secure drive. She made a time-stamped note for every minute of the confrontation. She wrote a short, composed statement, no invective, no theater. She listed the witnesses and asked for an internal hearing. She requested that all communications about the incident be logged and that her access be maintained pending review. There are people who assume the quiet ones are vulnerable because they do not shout. They misread restraint for weakness. Maya closed her laptop, folded her hands, and let the rain gather on the pavement outside. In her bag, under a folded notebook, was a small sealed envelope with a corporate seal she had been given months earlier. She had been given it by an older woman she loved, her grandmother, a woman who had taught her the calculus of patience. The envelope was labeled in neat type with the company name and a phrase Maya had been told to ignore until the right time, for beneficiaries' use in the event of dispute. She had not told people in the office about the envelope. No one would have known. For most of her internship, she had been careful to be one of the people who did not want privilege to soften them. She had wanted to learn the work on the ground. She had not wanted to carry notice like a banner. The envelope was not a trump card. It was a document of ownership that sat, quiet and lethal, in plain sight within her bag. She did not open it now. She did not need to. She had other things to do first. Procedure, record, witnesses, counsel. She had to make sure that what was recorded in people's phones and HR's memos matched the reality she intended to present. Calm, detailed, and undeniable. Back at the office, the rumor mill was already at work. Someone forwarded Anna's clip to a private group chat. The clip moved with the ease of digital gossip. It landed in the inbox of a reporter who paid attention to corporate controversies, in the hands of a client manager who asked legal if this was the kind of thing the company could dismiss lightly. The small dots began to connect. The wrong word used in a client meeting, an intern asked to be escorted out, a video clip that made Jonathan's decision look impulsive. For a company whose product was reputation, perception was a currency that could devalue quickly. Jonathan called the chair of the board, a woman named Claire Hammond, who had been on the board long enough to have a sense of prudence. Her voice was measured on the line. "We had to let her go. It was a performance issue," Jonathan said. Claire asked a few questions, not unkindly. "Were there witnesses? Have you documented it?" She did not assume the CEO's narrative over any other evidence. In the back of her mind were quarterly reports and investor letters, and the kind of neat, slow aversion to risk that had kept her reputation intact for decades. Jonathan tried to frame the incident as small, as managerial. Claire listened. She did not say anything particularly damning. She said, "Log it, prepare a memo for the board. If legal thinks it might escalate, we'll handle it." For Claire, that was a neutral instruction. She was a woman who had learned that a board's job was to be the company's slow-moving conscience. Documents mattered, dates mattered, facts mattered. A board meeting could be called for many reasons. A CEO behaving badly in public was, for Claire, one of many things that might eventually reach the table. Maya's filings landed in HR as a neat package: statements, recordings, witness notes, and a formal request for a board-level review, an extraordinary step for an intern, but not without precedent when the complaint was serious and the evidence clear. Ethan read the emails with a flinch. He had been in HR long enough to know how quickly office stories calcified into legal problems. He marked the case with a code that meant escalation. He sent a quiet reply. "We will begin an investigation and log this. You will have a case manager. Please do not contact other parties." Maya replied with a single sentence. "I will cooperate. I will preserve my evidence." She had done more than preserve. She had built a tidy string of digital breadcrumbs and added to them the analog certainty of the envelope that sat in her bag. The envelope was a quiet counterbalance to the public humiliation. It was not about personal revenge. It was about a mismatch of assumed power, how a man with a title could mistake his presence for permanent control. Over the next several days, the office air thickened. Memes of executives used as cautionary tales circulated in private channels. Clients asked their liaisons if everything at Cobalt Oak was in order. The company's legal counsel, a measured man with a soft baritone, requested a briefing. Jonathan, for the first time in years, felt the edges of his authority being measured by other surfaces, by legalese, by precedent, by the minutes of previous board meetings he had never read. Maya moved through her days with a purpose that felt steadier than rage. She sat with counsel in a narrow conference room while a lawyer with a loose tie explained process. She watched the lawyer make notes, the way someone charts coordinates before a journey. She met with Ethan from HR and gave a chronicle. She named witnesses, Anna, Jonah, and 2 others who had been in the meeting. She provided timestamps. She forwarded the recording. Her insistence on documents irritated some and steadied others. To a generation saturated with digital evidence, documentation was survival. To those who had long benefited from authority that did not require justification, it felt like an affront. In private, Jonathan tried to instrument a defense. He rehearsed his version of events with his communications director, who suggested language. "We handle performance decisively," the memo read. "We do not tolerate disruption." He was careful with that word disruption. In his mind, it was a euphemism that had 1,000 shields. But the recordings existed. Anna's video was not edited for drama. It simply set a camera down and let events speak. The clip did not need flourish. It needed clarity. It carried with it something that could not be unsaid. A man using his role to cut a person off, the word cultural fit placed like a verdict. Who owned the company was a technical question most employees assumed answered by the hierarchy on the org chart. Ownership did not present itself in the day-to-day meetings. It was a legal relation, a collection of shares and signatures and long-ago agreements. Few of the office staff lived with ownership in their daily vocabulary. Maya had lived with it because of the envelope and its promise, because family histories do not evaporate in a corporate lobby. She did not tell them about that envelope. She had reasons. To reveal it too soon would make the moment about her, and she wanted the moment to be about the process. She wanted the record to be crisp and indisputable. Ownership as a blow meant she would be reduced to spectacle. Ownership as leverage meant the board could no longer pretend the problem was merely interpersonal. The contrast between public performance and private papers was a motif that threaded through the company that week. Jonathan's speeches, crisp and rehearsed, grew tauter. He checked analytics, watched mentions, phoned the board chair again. He circulated memos about cultivating the brand and maintaining professional standards. He tried to frame the narrative in language that absolved him. But the company had begun to slide into a small cultural reckoning. Conversations that had been privately held, about who was listened to in meetings, about whose voice was deemed credible, about what constituted fit, began to find air. A quiet solidarity formed in corners even as others weighed loyalty to title. One afternoon, as the city was under a steady rain that made the windows bloom with streaks, Maya sat at her kitchen table and looked at the envelope. She thumbed the edge but did not open it. She thought about the day she had been given it. A woman with steady hands had told her, "Hold this, you may need it." It was not a flourish of privilege so much as a practical instruction, an inheritance of responsibility more than wealth. Maya made a list. She wrote the names of witnesses. She wrote what she wanted: a formal apology, documented policy changes about public termination, mandatory training on unconscious bias, and a public acknowledgement to be shared with staff. She did not write revenge. She did not want vitriol. She wanted systemic change. She wanted the company to have language for what had happened, so it could not hide behind the spontaneous mistakes of one man. She also, quietly, instructed counsel to prepare a request for a board-level hearing. She did not assume the board would act, but she knew that documents could force their hand. She was deliberate to call it a request, not an ultimatum. She wanted the optics to be procedural, not theatrical. When Jonathan next came into the office, he found a copy of Anna's clip in a private inbox under the subject line, "Escalation." He felt the shape of that clip the way a craftsman feels an imperfection on a finished surface. He tightened. He sent notes to legal. How quickly could the matter be closed? What precedent existed in our minutes? He asked the chair, "What would we do if an associate escalated to board level?" Claire replied with the coolness of a woman who knew how to ask for paper. "Prepare a memo. Let's review with counsel." Underneath Jonathan's irritation, there was a fear that tasted like vertigo. A man who has spent years flattening dissent into memos suddenly found that the architecture of the company might not support his permanence. He had not built a wall around his name so much as painted murals that relied on the silent consent of others. Now one woman with a phone had shown that the paint could crack. By the end of the week, the company had called for a preliminary review. HR had logged the complaint. The recordings were backed up in 2 places, and counsel had advised that the board might be briefed. The phrase, board-level review, moved through the offices like a low wind. It did not carry certainty, only possibility. Maya got the notice in the afternoon when the rain had stopped and the streetlights burned like spilled coins. The subject line read, "Request received, investigation initiated." It was bureaucratic and bland and exactly what she had asked for. The email also suggested a time frame, weeks, not days, and offered her an option for interim support, temporary reassignment, the ability to work remotely. She ticked a box to remain at the company while the process proceeded. She did not want to be pushed out by circumstance, and she did not want her presence to be framed as protest. That night, she sat at her window and watched the building across the street, its lights a constellation. She thought about how people in power mistake their titles for destiny, how they do not see that sometimes the building is older than the man in the suit. She thought about the envelope under her papers and the slow arithmetic of procedures. She did not sleep much. She read minutes from trustee meetings and shareholder notices, documents that till that point had been legal skeletons on shelves. She paged through them with the cautious curiosity of someone who has discovered an old map of a city she thought she knew. Names and dates, transfers of shares, annotations in the margins. The words on the old pages were small hands. They pointed to the possibility that the company's ownership was not a single man's fief. She thought about the board members. Claire Hammond's measured cool, the subtle political calculus of men and women who had long learned to prefer quiet to spectacle. If she were to take the matter to the board, she would not storm in with a cape and demand an execution. She would lay papers across a table and let facts sit there, heavy and patient. Her preparation was not the work of hubris. It was the work of someone who had been wronged and had chosen the machinery of accountability over the noise of retaliation. She was not the first person to file a complaint at Cobalt Oak, but she had something different than most: evidence, witnesses, and quietly, a document that linked her to the company's very title deeds. On Monday morning, she walked through the lobby with a folder under her arm. The elevator rose. Jonathan watched from a window seat in his office as the doors slid open and she stepped out. He thought he understood the whole of the situation: a little scandal, a little noise, a memo, a press release, and then the course would right itself. He did not yet see that the real danger to him was not the private scolding of a board, but the possibility that someone else held a ledger. Maya went to HR's office, where Ethan greeted her with a paper file. On the first page were printed copies: the recording, the witness accounts, a timeline. It was neat. She felt the slight, almost comic neatness of corporate processes, the way they took outrage and converted it into lists. Ethan touched the file and said, "We'll get you a hearing." He said it as if it were a small promise. For Maya, it was an arrival. She smiled once, briefly. "I will need it to be a board-level review," she said. "Not just HR." Ethan's eyes flicked up. "Do you understand that is extraordinary?" he asked. "I do," she replied. And there it was, a hinge. The room felt suddenly like a theater that had opened to a second act. The company's slow machinery could move in response, but all the turning cogs needed a reason and a push. Maya had given both, a voice and a folder and a recorded moment of the CEO's choice, and she had the composure to make the motion procedural rather than performative. Across town, the company's legal counsel made a note to the board: potential escalation requested by complainant. Recommend meeting of the executive committee to determine if full board review is necessary. It was bureaucratese meant to flatten emotion into motion. It also carried real consequences. The board, if convened, could compel testimony and examine registries and ask questions that would make the CEO accountable in a way no mere memo could. Jonathan sat back and read the council's memo. He felt a familiar muscle tighten in his jaw. He dialed the chair. Claire answered on the second ring. "We'll discuss it in the morning," she said. It was a neutral response, but in it was the sense that the company had protocols that superseded any one man's temperament. Maya listened to Claire's calm voice through the chain of corporate notes and realized something else. She was not angry in a way that required spectacle. She wanted the company to be able to answer questions without him in the spotlight. She wanted the policies that had allowed cultural fit to mean anything it pleased to be rewritten. She wanted people who had been whispered about to have their whispers collected into a record that could be read. On the day the executive committee convened, the building seemed thinner. Everyone felt the weather of the company's mood. Jonathan prepared a narrative. He rehearsed his language, calm, decisive. He would frame Maya as a poor fit, as a misalignment with client expectations. He would curate the facts to fit the frame. Maya prepared differently. She met with counsel in a small room and went over the list of witnesses. She practiced nothing. She read documents like a person working a map. She placed copies of Anna's recording and the witness statements in a manila folder and counted them. 1, 2, 3. She counted them as corollaries to a law she had always believed in. Fact is a kind of power. The night before the meeting, she slept poorly but held a clarity. The envelope in her bag felt like a promise she did not yet need to cash. For now, she would marshal the evidence and let the board do what boards do: weigh risk and precedent, ask questions, and, if necessary, pull back a man who had mistaken his bluster for authority. Morning came like a held breath. The executive committee assembled in the smaller boardroom with glass that made the city look like a spread of small squares. The committee's chair sat at the head. A legal counsel with a sober tie prepared notes. Jonathan arrived with the air of a man presenting a case he expected to win. Maya was not in the room yet. She had requested the full board, not merely the executive committee. The initial meeting was procedural. She watched from a distance as people took their seats. She watched Jonathan's hands on the table and the polished watch that had never been refused. The committee listened, and the recordings, when mentioned, shifted the conversation. Even small things, tone, microaggression, became visible in the audio. A phrase that had sounded casual when spoken aloud now had edges that landed. Claire, in the meeting, asked a question that bore neutral weight. If this escalates, what precedent do we have for handling such matters? She read from past minutes with the care of someone who had long preferred to trace the threads of small risks before they became insurable. Legal answered carefully. We could convene a board hearing if the complainant requests it. We can request the CEO's written account and corroborating witnesses. We can also ask for a proposed remediation plan. The committee debated the optics. The committee debated the liability. They were the kind of people who saw risk as a vector to be modeled. They could see the company's name on the line and measured it against the man's authority. When the committee adjourned, Claire lifted her phone and typed a message to Jonathan. We will convene a full board if the complainant requests. Prepare your notes. Jonathan exhaled in relief. Relief thin as a film. He understood the committee's instruction as a temporary reprieve. He assumed the default. The board would rubber stamp his judgment. It had happened before. History, he thought, was on a loop he could manage. Meanwhile, Maya received a calendar invitation that she had asked for. The subject line was sparse. Board hearing, request acknowledged. Time and date were set. The invitation carried an implicit weight. The board would gather. People in positions of power would be asked to account. She felt a low thrill of gravity. It was not triumph. It was a space where facts could take residence. She folded the top of the manila folder and held it like a small shield. She had witnesses lined up. Anna with her phone, Jonah with his shaky clip, a client who had been present and uncomfortable with the scene. She had counsel, she had documentation, and somewhere in her bag, beneath a notebook, the envelope she had been given waited with the patience of legal certainty. The invitation to the board hit Jonathan's inbox like a small coldness. He felt the shape of his week shift. He called his mentor on the board, a man who had built a career on smoothing furrows and spinning narrative. We'll weather it, his mentor said, but prepare for optics. Jonathan prepared. He wrote statements. He rehearsed language that minimized bias, that framed the action as managerial necessity. He did not think about the envelope. He did not think about the old list of shareholders, or the fact that ownership could be embodied by a document no one had read in years. The days between the committee and the board were taut. Everyone used them to prepare. People who had watched Jonathan's public rebukes of staff felt something like a tremor. The company's PR council drafted responses for various scenarios. The HR workflow increased in its polite hum of emails, and in the small corners of the office, private conversations took place. About fairness, about standards, about the taste of the word fit. One morning, as the sun came up pearly behind the glass facades, Maya walked into the building with a quiet that felt like readiness. She felt neither triumphant nor terrified. She had done the work she could, documented, collected, prepared, and made the request. The rest, she knew, would be the language of governance. She took the elevator to the 17th floor, where the board's meeting room sat like an island. The doors opened and she stepped onto the carpet. The room smelled faintly of coffee and wax polish. Chairs sat like islands facing each other. She placed her folder on the table and sat. Her hands were steady. Outside the windows, the city moved oblivious. Inside, a small table of people prepared for conversation that would shift the direction of a company. Maya thought for a moment of how small the steps had been that had led anyone to the office. A first job, a first promotion, a first phrase typed into an application. She thought about how power accrues quietly and often imperceptibly, and how sometimes it assumes a face and forgets the ledger that gave it count. A board meeting is not a courtroom, not in form. It is a tribunal of interests, a ledger in motion. It listens to facts and weighs reputational arithmetic. For Jonathan, it might be a place to defend a decision. For Maya, it might be a place to make the company answer. The board secretary read the agenda aloud. The topic of Maya's complaint was listed as an item. The room seemed to take on the weight of a hinge. Jonathan cleared his throat and began his account. Short sentences, a practiced cadence meant to frame. He had not yet heard the full measure of what was coming. He, who believed a title equal to destiny, prepared to defend a dismissal he had perceived as unremarkable. Maya sat and listened. She did not speak when he did. She let the room hear him first. He had the floor and used it. He had the posture of someone who had always had rooms bend to him. When her turn came, she rose with the file and walked to the head of the table. She placed documentation on the table, printed witness statements, the audio, timestamps. Her voice was calm, measured. She told the room the sequence of events plainly, without rhetoric, without flourish. She spoke of being asked a clarifying question, of being publicly admonished, of being given a termination letter without procedural documentation. She spoke of the recording and submitted it to the board. She asked for redress. The board members leafed through the pages with the patient curiosity of people who had been trained to measure risk. Faces shifted. The machine of governance began to whir. Some looked troubled. Some exchanged notes. Jonathan's face was tight. He tried the language of performance and client expectation, but the audio lay on the table and made a quiet, stubborn case. Claire leaned forward and said, in a voice that felt like an instrument tuned to caution, "We must consider whether the matter involves bias and whether adequate process was followed. If so, there are governance implications. We must consider whether the matter involves bias and whether adequate process was followed. If so, there are governance implications," Claire said, and the room held the soft rigidity of people who had been taught to let a sentence do its work. Jonathan's hand tightened on the edge of the table. He had prepared words, economical, polished, calibrated, but they felt suddenly thin around his clenched jaw. He opened his mouth, closed it, and tried again. This is about performance, about client confidence. The decision was managerial. Maya stood. She folded her folder's flap with careful fingers, the motion calm and deliberate as a hinge settling into place. She placed the manila folder on the table and then, without haste, reached into her bag. There are moments when the air waits to see what will happen next. People lean in because a room is a small geography and because whatever follows could change how the rest of the day is measured. Jonathan expected theatricality, anger, tears, a dramatic accusation that could be directed and dismissed. He did not expect documentation. Maya unbuttoned a slim envelope and slid it across the table. It was old, the paper slightly browned at the edges as if its weight had been measured by time. Printed on it was the company name and below that, a phrase in neat type. She did not open it yet. She let it sit between them like a quiet instrument. Before we proceed any further, she said, I want to be clear about what I am asking for. I request an independent review of the circumstances of my termination attempt, and I request appropriate remedies should bias be found. I will submit witness statements, the recording, and any other material the committee needs. I believe the facts will show procedural failure, and I will ask the board for accountability. She paused. Her voice was even, the kind of evenness that makes shocked things sound inevitable. Claire nodded, the way someone listens to facts rather than rhetoric. Legal counsel made a note. The secretary prepared to mark the record. Boardrooms are designed to translate conversation into minutes. Paper turns words into consequence. Jonathan had been ready for fending off accusations of tone. He had not been ready for the stillness that followed a person placing a sealed envelope on a table that had seen 100 signatures. There was a low rustle as people glanced at the envelope, then at Maya, then at the counsel across the table. Counsel cleared his throat. Ms. Bennett, are you also presenting additional documentation? Maya met his gaze. I am. I'm submitting copies of the recording and witness statements now, and, if requested, I will provide authenticated copies of a certified shareholder registry and related trust documents. The words landed with a peculiar gravity. Shareholder registry was a phrase like a small key. It opened a room many in this space rarely entered. Ownership, the ledger of control, was often treated in offices like a ghost, known but distant, referred to in investor letters but seldom brandished at the end of someone's pen. Jonathan's face went briefly white. He had built a life in the assumption that the day-to-day count of authority, the title, the team, the press photo, was the axis of permanence. He had not imagined anyone unfurling the legal scaffolding that sat behind the scaffolding of his power. Before he could move, Claire said, "If you have registry documents, submit them to counsel. We will examine them as part of the review. We will also hear the recording." Maya handed printed copies of Anna's recording transcription, the audio file on a memory drive, witness statements, and a carefully indexed binder. She did not open the envelope. She left that for the moment when the board's attention had been properly summoned. Jonathan tried to speak and was met with a tight corporate patience that had been practiced into him on skylit floors and donor dinners. "This is eminently manageable," he began. "We could—" "Hold," Claire said. She had the voice of someone who had been practicing the delicate weight of questions her entire career. "Counsel, please verify the status of the registry and advise whether the complainant's request for a board hearing should be entertained as filed." Counsel's fingers tapped. "We will need authenticated copies. If Ms. Bennett has them, the committee can receive them, and then the full board may act on recommendations." Maya slid the sealed envelope closer. It had the faint indentation of an official seal. When she finally broke the flap, she did so with a precise calm, not the breathy gesture of spectacle, but the sort of motion someone makes when opening a long-expected letter. Inside was a compact set of documents, a certified extract of the company's shareholder register, a notarized trust instrument naming a beneficiary, an older board minute with a transfer notation, and a short affidavit from an outside trustee. She placed them on the table like evidence, not like ammunition. Jonathan made a small, sharp sound, half laugh, half strangled protest. "This is a mistake," he said. "These can't—" Claire held up a hand. "Counsel, would you examine these documents?" Counsel and the corporate secretary exchanged a glance and set to work. They checked seals, signatures, notary stamps. These were not improvised papers. They bore the careful marks of legal formality: stamps, dates, signatures, a corporate seal with an embossed ring. "Ms. Bennett," counsel said after a few minutes that felt to the rest of the room like minutes and to Maya like a sensible pause, "these documents purport to show that a trust, of record with the company's historical papers, named the current beneficiary as the owner of a controlling block of shares, transferred at a date consistent with the trust instrument. The registrar's annotation aligns with the trust. If authenticated, this would indicate that you hold controlling interest through the trust vehicle." There was a low murmur. Board members glanced at one another as if measuring the topography of a phrase. Jonathan's mouth worked. He lifted a hand, then dropped it. "This must be a forgery," he said, and for the first time in months his voice lacked the practiced polish. "I have been on the board." Claire's tone did not mimic outrage or triumph. It remained the cool instrument of slow governance. "The committee will verify. Counsel will contact the registrar and confirm the chain of custody for these documents. If they are authentic, we have to treat this as a matter of ownership and governance and act accordingly." Outside the boardroom glass, the city kept moving, indifferent to the small rearrangement of power taking place in this room. Inside, the mechanics of corporate legitimacy, registrations, minute books, trust instruments, were assembling to meet the spectacle of managerial hubris. A secretary crossed to a side table and sent an email to the corporate registrar, attaching the scanned documents and requesting certified confirmation of the share register entry. The response would take time, but counsel had a list of steps that could accelerate the verification: calls to the registrar, a request for a certified printout, an inquiry to the independent transfer agent. While they waited, Jonathan tried to shape the narrative. He stood and paced in the small geography in front of his chair, the motion of a man who was used to moving the room with command. He appealed to precedent and performance. He described a morning meeting with a client that had gone sideways and spoke about optics and standards, as if all of that were a matrix that could flatten questions about justice. Maya listened. She knew the language. She had heard it in memos and meetings, a thin varnish that often slid over the realities of who was listened to and why. She did not interrupt. She had papers, she had witnesses, she had the recording. The sealed envelope was not a threat. It was a legal fact. Anna spoke quietly at first, then louder as confidence found her throat. "I recorded it," she said. "I started the recording when Mr. Hale raised his voice. It was—" She stopped for a second, the words uneven. "It was not about performance. It was a public humiliation. I didn't want to be in the room when he does that to people." Anna's voice made the room smaller in a humane way. Jonah, the colleague with the shaky camera, nodded. "I have a video of the whole thing," he said. "It's shaky, but you can see how it happened." A board member, younger than most, leaned forward. "This is the kind of evidence that boards cannot ignore," she said. "It's not just an HR matter if a CEO uses his office to humiliate and there's a pattern." Patterns were a thread many hoped would remain private. Saying pattern aloud made the quiet things audible. Counsel returned from a quick call. "The registrar is responding. They are pulling certified extracts now. It may take an hour, but they have acknowledged the request." An hour in a boardroom is a long time. People talk about precedent and future optics. They discuss PR drafts and investor letters, and they imagine the kinds of questions that will multiply in other rooms. Jonathan's gestures grew sharper. He sent a terse message to PR, then another to the legal counsel on the outside who had been advising him informally. He wondered out loud about the authenticity of the paper and whether the documents could be a targeted attack. Claire watched him balance indignation and deflection with a wary eye. "You will have your opportunity to present your account," she said. "But if the documentation is authenticated, and if the recording supports the complainant's account, the board must consider action that may include suspension pending investigation and remedial governance measures." Jonathan's face flushed. For the first time, he seemed to see the shape of a path that did not end with his version prevailing. He imagined investor calls, a tarnished brand, a column in a business weekly. He had built his identity in the intervals between applause and award-giving. The idea of a board examining his behavior made his hands small. The registrar's emailed certification arrived as a polite electronic chime. Counsel opened it, scanned it, and read it aloud, with the kind of procedural cadence that made technical certainty sound like a verdict. The extracted register bore entries. The transfer notation was dated years prior, supported by a trust instrument registered with the corporate secretary at the time. The trust named a beneficiary who, by subsequent paperwork, was the person seated at the table. Claire let the sentence hang. A single board member made a small practical sound. "If this is in order," she said, "then Ms. Bennett's legal status aligns with what she claims. She holds controlling interest through the trust instrument." Jonathan's throat made a dry sound. His mind, conditioned to assume that titles and photos and press rosters conferred the summit of power, had not accounted for the possibility that somewhere, in a file no one had read, sat the actual counts that translated into control. He had never found it necessary to read minute books or long-ago conveyances. He had assumed the architecture of the company matched his architecture of authority. Maya did not gloat. That was never the point. She had wanted the company to answer, not to stage a spectacle. She had wanted an apology and policy changes, not a private victory. But the narrow arc from humiliation to accountability required an instrument to be pulled. Paper was that instrument in this room. Counsel advised the board to convene an immediate vote to suspend the CEO pending a full governance review. Given the seriousness of the allegations, the existence of contemporaneous recordings, witness testimony, and documents suggesting Ms. Bennett holds controlling interest through the trust, the prudent course is to suspend Mr. Hale pending investigation and to appoint an interim CEO. There was a flurry then of quiet, efficient moves. Corporate governance is a choreography of votes and proxies, of declarations and recorded minutes. Board members pulled devices out, a practical act of democracy in felt ties and polished watches. The motion was placed, seconded, and debated with the kind of technical vocabulary that reduces spectacle to procedure. Arguments were made for due process and against inaction. The room weighed reputation and fiduciary duty. Jonathan moved to stand and speak, but Claire lifted a hand as if cutting a thread. "We will follow protocol," she said. "This is not a personal vendetta. It is governance." The vote was called. It was not unanimous. Some hesitated, wary of sudden upheaval. But enough directors, when confronted with authenticated documents and a clear recording, chose the language of prudence over the language of protection. The tally favored suspension pending a full review and an independent investigator. When the board secretary read the result aloud, the sound in the room was not triumph so much as the pragmatic silence of consequence. Jonathan's posture, which had seemed almost cathedral in its certainty that morning, folded into something smaller. He sat. He inhaled as if for a speech, but his words came out like a man reading old scripts. "This is unfair," he said. "This is—" Claire's voice was unflinching. "The board has taken a decision based on the gravity of the complaint and the need to protect the company's governance. Mr. Hale, you will be suspended with pay pending the investigation. Council will oversee immediate steps to ensure continuity." Security asked him to gather personal items. He looked at the board as if expecting solidarity, some handshake or hand on a shoulder. The room's faces were divided between colleagues who had sheltered his trajectory and the sober faces of those who could see the risk to the company. An assistant arrived with a box for his belongings. The motion of being escorted out was kept professional. No roughness, no theater. The guard who had reached for Maya earlier lingered near the door, his posture different now. The public instrument of enforcement that had once signaled company control repointed. As Jonathan passed Maya on the way out, their eyes met. He had the red flush of a man who had been unmade by facts he did not control. Maya's face was neutral. She did not raise a hand. She did not smile. She had not sought this spectacle of retribution. Outside the boardroom, the elevator doors closed on him. The room felt a shade quieter, the city beyond the glass continuing to run its indifferent errands. Papers were arranged, minutes would be written, council would plot the next steps. PR drafted a tight statement advising that the company had suspended its CEO pending investigation and was instituting an independent review into allegations of misconduct and process failures. The statement did not require the spectacle of a televised reprimand. It translated a room's decision into sentences that could be printed and sent. It was corporate language, the measured voice of damage control and governance. For Maya, the outcome was not simple catharsis. She had seen the thinness of triumph. She had watched careers fold and knew the human costs of ruin. She walked back to her seat and tidied her papers. Claire offered a formal request. "Ms. Bennett, given your position and your requests, will you provide a written notice of desired remedies to the committee? We will include them in the scope of the investigation." Maya had a list. She had wanted a formal apology. Structural changes to prevent managerial humiliation. Mandatory training on bias. Clearer HR protocols about public terminations. And an independent ombudsman. She had wanted a company that could name its mistakes without first needing to be forced. She also quietly requested the immediate suspension of any private security protocol that permitted physical escort without prior formal notice and the anonymized release of the investigation's findings to staff. Claire listened and nodded. "Those are within the scope of the board's purview. We will include them." Council requested a short break to coordinate statements. People rose, collected files, and left in groups, some to the stairwell, some to the elevator, to another meeting, to draft emails. The boardroom emptied in the ordinary way, as if a theater shedding its audience between acts. When the door closed, there was a pressing silence that belonged not to victory, but to a kind of sober relief. Maya sat for a long moment and then gathered her things. Anna met her outside with eyes that were damp and practiced a small, careful smile. Jonah's camera was tucked away. He offered her his phone and she scrolled through the 2 clips he had taken, then set them to a secure drive she could give to council. Outside, the rain had started again, this time with a clean, steady rhythm. The glass of the lobby blurred the city into watercolors. Lights shimmered like distant beacons. Maya stepped into the sheeted rain and felt the wet press of it on her face. The jacket she had draped over her shoulders clung with drops. There was no crowd of onlookers, no cheering. The rain washed the polished stone as if it were cashing a small private check. At the curb, she caught sight of Jonathan in the lobby. He was standing beneath the building's overhang as if reluctant to be fully exposed. He had his box of papers with him, and his face was like a map of indignation, worry, and a quiet, new kind of fear. He looked as if he had been stripped down to what the minutes would say. A man now subject to process. Their eyes met in the same way they had in the corridor, two small glances borrowing the same light. He looked for an instant like a man who had learned about the limitations of title. He looked at her and then away. Maya did not watch him leave. She watched the rain, felt it on her collar, and thought of the envelope in her bag. She could have made a harsh decision from the moment the registry had been verified. She could have insisted on his immediate removal without process, a spectacle of vengeance that would have satisfied the appetites of gossip and viral headlines. Instead, she had chosen procedure. Power, she had learned, is sometimes best exercised through the scaffolding of institutions. Minutes, signatures, certified copies. The envelope had been a quiet answer to a public wrong, not a weapon to be waved in anger. She had chosen to harness fact and process. Those were durable. They changed the company's infrastructure, not merely a day in its calendar. In the days that followed, the company issued a short statement. An independent investigation would proceed. The CEO had been suspended pending the findings, and the board would engage an external auditor to review governance and HR practices. The PR phrasing was careful. The internal memo to staff was more candid. HR announced mandatory training and an ombuds program. Council advised on communications and confidentiality. It was not a sweeping revolution. It was governance doing what governance does, correcting risk when facts required it. There were conversations, awkward and sincere, in the cafeteria and in private Slack channels. Some employees who had once stayed quiet found their voices. Some who had defended the CEO in the past were quieter now. Anna received a note from a colleague thanking her for recording. Jonah's shaky video became a case study in the small power of bearing witness. As for Jonathan, the suspension allowed him time to compose a textual defense and seek legal counsel. There would be conversations about his future, negotiations over severance and reputation. The board, mindful of legal risk and investor optics, moved to appoint an interim CEO and to expedite an independent review. The velocity of his fall was not theatrical cruelty. It was the company's machinery working to protect itself. Maya returned to a different kind of ordinary. She was asked whether she wanted to take a leave of absence while the investigation proceeded, and she declined. She wanted to stay engaged. She wanted the changes she sought to come from within. She met with staff gathered for a frank conversation convened by HR, where she listened while people told stories of small humiliations that had accumulated. She did not take these testimonies as currency for public spectacle. She took them as data. A week later, under a sky that had been scrubbed by rain, the board released a short public statement summarizing the interim measures: suspension of the CEO, appointment of an interim executive, and the initiation of an independent investigation into allegations of improper conduct and process failures. The company pledged to follow the investigation's recommendations publicly. Investors asked quiet questions. Clients asked to be assured that deliverables would not be affected. Life at the company pulled taut but did not unravel. On a bright Thursday in the weeks that followed, the board convened again. The external investigator had prepared a report. The recording and witness statements established that the CEO had publicly dismissed an employee without following adequate procedure, and that the language used and the context pointed to a pattern of marginalizing behavior that had been tolerated in small increments. The report recommended, based on governance, that the board remove him and institute structural reforms including an independent ombuds, mandatory bias training for senior executives, and new checks on unilateral terminations. The vote was taken. The motion to remove carried. It was not malicious. It was corporate arithmetic made firm. When Jonathan was asked to submit his resignation, his hand shook with a small human thing, the knowledge that reputation is brittle and that some falls are not undone by the tidy language of a PR release. He signed what was asked, packed what he needed, and left with his box under the watchful gaze of a polite security team. Maya watched him go. She did not celebrate. There was no moment of theatrical triumph. Power had a way of quieting into a new normal. The board installed an interim CEO. The company's press release thanked Jonathan for his service in the language board's use for endings and offered openness about improvements to governance. The release emphasized process. The headlines varied. Some framed it as accountability, others as inevitable corporate housekeeping. For Maya, there was something private and final in the way authority had been rearranged. She returned to her desk and swiped her badge with the same small motion she had used weeks earlier when they had escorted her out. The access light blinked green. It was a simple thing. It was also a small proof. The card that let a person pass through doors had once felt like an instrument of small indignities. Now it sat with the quiet weight of someone who had used the company's own systems to hold it to account. At the next staff meeting, Claire joined in, unrehearsed, human, and thanked employees for their patience. She acknowledged failings and said the company would do better. The language was exacting, not florid. The reforms were pragmatic, clear protocols for terminations, mandatory documentation, a safe channel for complaints, public summaries of independent reviews. The company would not erase what had been done, but it would make a recorded effort to translate harm into structure. And then, a month later, at the charity gala the company hosted, an evening where velvet ropes framed donors and the chandelier cast a modest light, Maya stood in a quieter corner and watched the room she had once slotted herself into as an intern. She wore a simple dress, her badge tucked into a pocket. The crowd moved with practiced laughter. She observed the way people posed beside plaques and gazed at nameplates and referred to titles as if they were maps. She had been offered quietly a seat at the founders' table as a stakeholder representative. She accepted with a small nod and a steady hand. That night, as the orchestra supplied a light soundtrack and silverware chimed, she spoke to a few people about policy and hiring practices, about mentorship and access, and the reality that cultures change only when instruments within institutions move. People listened. Some nodded. Some promised support. Outside later, the city was gleaming and wet. Rain had followed the gala until the sidewalks reflected the lights in a wash of color. A velvet rope was being adjusted near the entrance. The guard from weeks ago, whose hand had once lightly sought to guide her, stood by, professional and a bit sheepish. He saw her and gave a small, genuine nod. She returned it. At the curb, she let the rain find the shoulders of her coat. She felt no parade in her chest, only the quiet relief of a person who had demanded what any decent system should provide. That wrongs be recorded, that evidence be listened to, that institutions be able to correct themselves. She had not been interested in spectacle. She had been interested in making a company answerable. She thought of the envelope now tucked in a secure file with counsel, a legal fact that had catalyzed a process rather than fed a vendetta. She thought of Anna and Jonah and the other witnesses who had, with little courage and a great deal of simple decency, recorded a moment and made it part of the ledger. The rain blurred the city into soft impressions. For once, she walked without hurry. She walked as someone whose dignity had been restored not by a viral clip or a shaming post, but by the slow institutional machinery of verification and consequence. That was a narrow triumph. Less celebratory, more structural. It would, she hoped, prevent a next person from being cut off by a white-polished pronouncement of cultural fit. When she reached the street, her phone buzzed with messages, some grateful, some stunned, some pragmatic with suggestions on next steps. She replied with measured notes to counsel and HR and to the board liaison, laying out the remedial steps she wanted to see enshrined. She wrote succinctly, "We need a safe process. We need transparency. We need to acknowledge harm." A month later, the company published a summary of the independent review's recommendations and the board's action plan. There were new policies, new checkpoints on unilateral terminations, a mandate for an ombuds office, and a commitment to regular public updates. It was not a utopia. It was a step, structural, not theatrical. Maya continued her work. She stayed on not because she sought the title, but because she wanted to watch whether institutions could learn. She mentored interns. She spoke in small groups about the importance of documentation, about how a phone, a timestamp, and a careful note could be the tools that transform humiliation into evidence. She never used the envelope as a boast. She treated it as a reminder of the weird, quiet power of archives. Months later, walking through the lobbies of other buildings, She would sometimes see people, young, wary, who carried their access cards like talismans. She would remember standing beneath the atrium lights as Jonathan had done, and she would think of the fragile architecture of authority. Titles are made of material things, polished letters on a door, the tilt of a photograph, a watch that tells you how much you have earned. But ownership and accountability live in registries, in minutes, in notarized signatures, places most people never visit. As for Jonathan, his career continued in different permutations, an advisory role elsewhere, op-eds about leadership, a book clause in an unnamed publisher's pipeline. That was not a punishment designed by Maya. It was the real-world consequence of a life that had leaned too heavily on title without accounting for ledger. He learned in the slow and practical way corporate people learn that the world keeps records. The last image of the episode was small and deliberate, Maya standing under fresh rain, the city refracting around her like scattered glass. Her badge was clipped to her coat. She pressed its plastic edge once against the reader as she walked back into the building. The green light flashed, the door opened. She stepped inside. If anyone wanted to know whether the punishment had fit the crime, the answer lay not in spectacle, but in the quieter currency of reform. She had not sought to ruin a man. She had sought that wrong be acknowledged, that systems be fixed, and that people be given the dignity to work without humiliation. The boardroom had turned because she had asked it to, and because the company's own papers had been patient enough to hold the truth until someone asked. Tell us in the comments, was the outcome fair? Would you have acted the same? If this story mattered to you, subscribe for more real-life dramas where power meets procedure.